From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We're joined, as always, with our guest producer, Max Freight Train Williams. Most importantly, you are here, and that makes this the stuff they don't want you to know. This is quite a fascinating conversation that we're bringing to you today, fellow conspiracy realist. It contains some frank and graphic discussion of violence and possibly ongoing conspiracy. We're not diving into this alone. We are joined with a returning guest, the award-winning host and producer, creator of Sleepwalkers, creator of Forgotten Women of Juarez, and a personal friend of the show, Oz Woloshyn. Oz, welcome back, man.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always such a pleasure, Ben and Noel and Matt. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. We, this newest project of yours, Silence the Radio Murders, speaks to something that I think will fascinate all of our fellow listeners, because it's a story that maybe people in the West were aware of in the broad strokes, but this is one of the only in-depth, sophisticated reporting pieces that I have personally encountered on this. And maybe that's where we start. Let's see, Matt made a great point off air. Maybe we start with the lay of the land of Haiti, because for a country that is so close to the U.S., it's astonishing how little a lot of people know about it.
Absolutely. I mean, Haiti is, a couple of 100 miles off the coast of Florida. It's half of an island that was formerly known as Hispaniola. The other half is the Dominican Republic. And it has both one of the most romantic and inspiring histories of any country in the world, and also the most tragic. It was a French slave colony, and in 1804 there was a slave rebellion led by a man called Toussaint Louverture, which overthrew Napoleon's armies. It was the first and only fully successful slave rebellion that gave birth to a nation. And so Haiti has this enormous sense of pride and dignity and a celebration of that revolutionary spirit. At the same time, the country has never really been allowed to be forgiven for throwing off its colonial masters. So one of the things that probably a lot of people are aware of is this issue of reparations. Haiti had to actually pay reparations to France for almost 100 years, I think, in return for its freedom.
Isn't it the slaves that usually get the reparations? It seems a little backwards.
It should be. It certainly should be. And the French, basically, their navy threatened to blockade Haiti's port and prevent it from trading unless they paid these reparations. So then, obviously, and please interrupt me because I don't want to just be going on and on, but then as French colonial power receded, U.S. colonial power rose. And there was something called the Monroe Doctrine in the early 20th century. The Monroe Doctrine basically asserted that the United States couldn't allow any European colonial powers to have any purchase in its, backyard, i.e. Central America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And, in some sense, maybe fine, but what that practically meant was it wasn't they wanted to necessarily free these countries from European colonial influence. It was just that they wanted to replace the colonial influence with their own. And so Haiti, which many people don't know, was actually occupied by American troops from 1915 to 1934.
General Smedley Darlington Butler.
Exactly right. Yes, who I know is the subject of another one of your investigations. And was it him who had that appalling quote about fancy that, black speaking French? That was the extent of his knowledge of Haiti when he was administrating it.
Yeah, he was a real pill, that guy. Problematic figure, and unfortunately not uncommon in the in the larger sort of landscape of colonial powers and hegemonic ambitions, or ambitions to be the hegemon. And this, I think you've done a beautiful job sort of painting this picture. If we fast forward a bit, we know that those problems have intergenerational ramifications that continue, unfortunately, today. A lot of people in the Haitian diaspora, they moved away from their homeland to other countries, usually to closer countries, sometimes to other things in the Francophone sphere. And a lot of people ended up in Miami, in a place called Little Haiti, where our story takes place.
That's exactly right. So basically, in the 60s, this guy, Francois Papadoc Duvalier, emerged as the president of Haiti. And he was initially quite popular because Haiti is predominantly black, but had been ruled by this what was called the mulatto elite, which was French and black mixed families essentially. And Papadoc was a doctor who was actually worked with the Americans and brought some quite important medical innovations to Haiti, and was a preacher of this thing called negritude, which is like black gratitude, I guess. And so he was very, very popular with the kind of working class Haitian black population. But he quickly took a very, very nasty turn and became one of the most brutal and wild and perverse dictators of the 20th century. He had a special torture room in his palace with a peephole installed so that he could watch people being tortured to death. I mean, the guy was really appalling.
Is this where the tauntaun comes in?
Yeah, so he didn't trust the army because the army was run by this mulatto elite. So he basically founded this private militia called the Tonton Macoutes, who were drawn from the poorest people in Haitian society, but they weren't paid, but they were given a gun and told, you can earn your own salary with this gun. And that was
So mercenaries, essentially, like unpaid mercenaries.
Unpaid mercenaries, exactly. And preying on the population. So it was a horrible time. Baby Doc, Papadoc's son, who was 19 years old, succeeded his father. He was a playboy, actually got Haiti involved in the cocaine trade with his big innovation to fund his lifestyle as a transshipment point between Colombia and Miami. But the Duvaliers were really, really brutal, and a lot of people fled to Miami to get away from them. The Duvaliers also, we should know, because I'm sure we'll come on to this, were kind of supported from time to time by the US, whose biggest fear, which hangs over this whole story, was Haiti becoming another Cuba. And the Duvaliers and many people who succeeded them were very successful in playing that fear to get what they wanted. But yeah, Miami became this hotbed of revolutionary Haitians, effectively, who had fled the Duvalier regime. Many of them had fled for things like speaking out loud or criticizing the Duvalier regime. They risked their lives on boats to come to Miami. But it was this self-selecting community of, smart, active, ideologically driven people who had been willing to risk their life at sea rather than be silenced. And then they got to Miami, and go figure, they started talking, and they found this very interesting moment in Miami media history where AM radio was being parceled up and sold by the hour. And so you could buy airtime for $200 an hour.
Like public access, essentially, or cable, whatever, anyone could have their own show if they could pay up.
Exactly. But for hundreds of dollars, right?
Yeah, a couple of $200 an hour, I think.
Wow.
So they had to do advertising. They had to basically, again, they had to figure out how to make it work. So they did a lot of advertising for local businesses, that kind of thing. But they also used these airwaves to basically call out the influence of the Duvaliers and their successors, both in Miami and more widely in the US, and to call for regime change and to finance regime change. They were actually raising money in Miami using the radio to send to the opposition movement in Haiti. And that's when the killing started.
Yeah, because it's almost like there's this illusion of safety where you're in the United States. These folks have already risked their lives to get to the United States. And now they have this newfound freedom to speak out. And maybe a sense of security, thinking they can do this, they can affect change, they can send money back home, and that they'll be isolated from this brutal regime back home. But I think maybe the thesis of your show is that maybe not.
Yeah, exactly right.
Well, yeah, the concept of that Tonton Macoute, right? That the security force, this weird de facto private thing that they've got going on in Haiti, it didn't just exist in Haiti. It also made its way over to the U.S. in some way, right? Or was it, I might be getting this mixed up with FRAP, which is a whole other organization.
You're right, Matt. And FRAP and the Tonton Macoutes are basically two sides of the same coin. The Tonton Macoutes kind of evolved into FRAP, which was another extrajudicial paramilitary force, except their job was to buttress the military regime that succeeded the Duvaliers. But yeah, I mean, they were spies. There were spies in Miami, Tonton Macoute spies, whose job was to keep an eye on the community, make lists, report back on what was going on, because the Duvaliers knew that the only way they could stay in power was to continue to have the support of the US and US policy. And so a group of vocal, ethnic potential voters in Miami actually could be quite threatening. And so they were really, I mean, there are stories of people bumping into the people who tortured them at the grocery store. But there was basically a campaign of intimidation saying, don't speak, don't raise money, don't put your head above the parapet, don't get involved in organizing here in Miami, because if you do, you'll pay with your life. And that seems to be what happened.
And there were also some further ramifications for the population of Little Haiti in terms of their status with the United States, right? Which would determine what the U.S. would do or how the U.S. would treat them, whether they were economic refugees or whether they qualified as political asylum seekers, right? And it sounds like a bit of a legalistic distinction, but from what we understand, that's a huge deal. And that's something that really came to the forefront when people started connecting the dots on the murders. I mean, Oz, could you tell us a little bit about how the first murder occurs and people already are living in this very tense, very threatening environment, right? No one, as you said, wants to stick their head over the parapet. This is a journalist who has been speaking truth to power. Do people in the Haitian community immediately begin assuming that this was not a random murder?
Yeah, so in December of 1990, President Aristide was elected the first ever democratic president of Haiti. And it was a huge moment. There were, basically almost 100% of the population voted for him. The whole island was being, spontaneously redecorated. And particularly the diaspora community in Miami were absolutely thrilled. And the first victim was a radio broadcaster called Jean-Claude Olivier. And he'd been partying on the streets in Miami when the election results were announced. The election was in December. The inauguration was scheduled for February. And in January, in Haiti, there was actually a coup attempt against Aristide by the military to prevent him from coming to power. That failed, but there was a lot of static in Miami as well. The old guard were basically trying to figure out, how do we hold on to our privilege? How do we hold on to our power? And so Jean-Claude Olivier was using his airwaves to basically call these people out to say, it's time for change. And he was getting threats into the radio station saying, if you don't shut up, you'll be killed. But he kept going.
He had a motto, right? Didn't he have a personal motto that was, when they tell me to shut up, I'm just going to say whatever I want? I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially This was his whole deal.
That was his whole deal, exactly. And but he was also something of a kind of, party guy. He was involved in music promotion.
Club figure, right? Almost like a Studio 54 impresario type
Street
character.
name, Division Star.
Division Star, exactly. And a flashy dresser and, ladies' man, all those things. The night he died, he was promoting a Haitian-American band called Top Vice. And what one of the people who was there that night, who was actually a police officer, told us, is that he started talking about politics and basically celebrating the election results on stage. And people started booing, and he was kind of bundled off stage. And then, as he was on his way to his car, about 4 a.m, he got shot assassination style with several bullets, some of which lodged in his body and some of which lodged in the car. Immediately afterwards, there was a little bit of doubt about why he was killed, because honestly, 90s Miami, anyone involved in the nightclub scene was, potentially also involved in the underworld in some respects. There was a lot of cocaine trafficking at the time. And so there was almost like a concerted effort, I would say, to smear Jean-Claude and say that, his death was because he was wrapped up in some kind of shady business. But then just a few weeks later, another radio broadcaster was murdered, Fritz Dorr. Very different profile. He was an immigration paralegal, looked after his disabled brother and 6 children, even more vocal than Jean-Claude on the air. And he was shot dead as he left his job at a driving school in a car park, right in the heart of Little Haiti, which some people saw as a kind of symbolic killing, saying, we can get you even here. And after that second killing, the doubts about the first killing began to recede.
Is Dorr's killing the one where we get into a strange tactic by assassins that was noticed by people, where there were wigs involved and dress, like female dress or something like that?
Yeah, so the police report, we were able to get it. We did a FOIA and we got the kind of some semi-redacted police report. And it's a really wild document. It's, you can kind of feel the probably Anglo police officers receiving this, fire hose of information and just not really knowing how to process it. So, yes,
and that's a Freedom of Information Act request.
Freedom of Information Act
played along at home. Yeah,
exactly. And sometimes they don't redact it as carefully as they should. So there were some like names and stuff which were redacted in some places and not in others. So that was quite helpful. Wow. But yes, I mean, there was in the police report, there's a man dressed in a wig and women's clothing was seen fleeing the scene. And we thought that was kind of a weird detail. We did some research and we found out that was apparently the classic disguise of the tonton macoutes, the paramilitary sometimes in Haiti. So that lead never went anywhere, and it may have been... there may have been an assumption this was something to do with the tonton macoutes, and that was a kind of way of signaling it. We don't know where that information came from, or because it turned out that in fact the shooters were in a car and they fled the scene in a car, as we later discovered.
And we also in Silenced, we start to experience the process of connecting some of these dots. One thing that's really interesting was the first murder with Olivier. But actually, both of these murders so far, I think we could say they were pay for play. Like, these people were being financially compensated, correct? There was not just a personal grudge, right? Like, you didn't promote my band or something.
No, I mean, again, there were rumors at the beginning that this was personal grudges. And in fact, another weird element of the initial police report is this guy basically gives a false confession and says that he killed Fritz because of some stolen drugs. And that information, leaked its way into the community, but that guy actually recanted his confession. Nonetheless, he was prosecuted, went to jail, and then the state actually vacated his conviction. So it was like completely made up. And you have to wonder, like, why would this young, teenage kid with 6 police officers standing over him say that the victim had been killed over drugs? I mean, you have to feel like somebody was feeding him that. It's just too weird.
It's a pretty typical hallmark of these kind of fix-ups, where they have to have a fall person, and oftentimes those confessions are recanted or details emerge that it was, coerced or in some way done under duress. So, I mean, that's not unusual at all, and I think, while not proof positive, very, very suspicious.
Absolutely. But then, yes, it turned out they were able to, I think we have a relatively high degree of confidence, identify and convict the shooter and the driver. But as to who paid them, the police to this day have never uncovered. We developed some leads, but remarkably frustrating, particularly as the killings continued, even with the shooter in jail.
Okay, let's take a quick pause here for a word from our sponsor, then we're going to come back with more from Oz.
And we've returned with Oz Woloshyn.
Let's talk about Louis Thermatus, I think is how you say it.
That's right.
This is a fascinating character that comes into the story here. He owns a music shop, right? Or a music store.
Yeah.
But he's also an events promoter or music promoter of some sort. How I really want to talk about the export of culture, right? Export of music and everything that's happening there, as well as the export of drugs, as Haiti is playing this very crucial part as a midway point, right, to get cocaine into the U.S. Like, how does that all come together, and what part does Louis play?
Well, for the sake of legal, Louis.
Been there, man.
Yeah.
Been there.
Wait, should we call him something else, Oz?
No, I think we use his name in the podcast, so it's fine. But we're very clear that he was never convicted of any crime in relation to these murders or in relation to drug trafficking. We didn't find any evidence, hard evidence, that he was responsible. But there were certainly all of these leads that suggested he knew more. And so we actually we tracked him down, which you can hear in the show. But yes, and the police tried to run a wiretap on him, but it according to a DEA agent, the wiretap was botched. So he was this kind of looming figure in the background. He was accused by the community of being a tonton macoute, which he denied. And he was described by a police officer who he interviewed as a middleman and a distributor. And his business was described as, quote, an extension of the government of Haiti. So that was kind of really fascinating. But yes, I mean, he brought Haitian music, Haitian bands to Miami. And of course, the power of music to bring people together and to have influence in a small community is very strong. And so he's an influential figure. He had money. Again, there are allegations that he was involved in the drug trade, which we didn't corroborate, but certainly he was a person of interest to the DEA. And so stories started to spread that he was in some way involved in the killings. And in fact, Matt, to your excellent question, the tinderbox, at least for the first two killings, seems to have been one of his concerts.
So this is kind of the elephant in the room for a lot of people who maybe aren't in the Haitian community, but live near Little Haiti. They're thinking, like you said, about nightclub lifestyle. They're thinking about drugs, and they may not be fully aware of the way Haiti has become a functioning transit point for the cocaine trade in particular. But it seems that some U.S. forces were very intimately aware of this. And Oz, we have to ask you, how does the CIA show up in this story?
Well, it's a complicated one.
By the way, I totally put my finger on the scale of that question where I'm like, drugs. Anyway, CIA, what's up?
So obviously, we all know about the CIA's history in the 80s involving drugs and weapons and money and fueling, Nicaragua, exactly. Fueling anti-communist militias and death squads. And so, interestingly, the Duvalier regime fell in 1986. Baby Doc Duvalier was never really interested in governing, only interested in, French champagne and fancy clothes and money. And so there was actually a military coup against him in 1986. But the military leaders who succeeded him, many of whom had been trained at the Army School of the Americas in Georgia, which obviously is a well-known CIA recruiting spot. And the CIA
listen to our episode on that.
Oh,
okay,
actually,
sorry,
I will.
That's to everybody else.
No, I'm sorry. I should have done that already. That was crazy. But I'm really looking forward to it because you obviously know much more about it than I do. But so they were these military types who took over were some of them were later revealed to be on the CIA payroll. Suddenly, they had a lot of contact over the year with U.S. intelligence. And the CIA put together a report in 1988 saying basically, if Haiti doesn't have strong rule, like a desperate government could turn to the USSR instead. And so this is really late 80s. The CIA is still worried that Haiti might go Cuba's way, 2 years before the end of the Cold War and become a kind of Russian satellite island. And so that informed every part of the CIA's policy in Haiti, which included, having these military leaders on the payroll. It also included setting up this counter-narcotics intelligence force called the SIN, or the acronym was SIN, which was probably a little bit unfortunate.
Bit on the nose.
And these SIN leaders became basically, because they had, untrammeled power, in Haiti, they became the favored liaison of the Colombian cartels, and drug trafficking through Haiti just exploded at this time. And so you had this ironic situation where the CIA's sort of chosen partners in terms of governance and intelligence were also operating on behalf of the Colombian cartel. And there's one very telling story that actually isn't in the podcast, but is kind of fascinating, which is there was a DEA bust in 1991 of a relatively high-ranking SIN person, and the DEA guy basically nailed down how this guy was involved in Colombian cocaine trafficking, and for the DEA it was like a big moment. They thought they were going to finally unwind this network, but then the DEA agent got a death threat called into his home by somebody who identified himself as the superior of this SIN agent, i.e. like one of the leaders of the military junta. And rather than any response from the US, the guy was just immediately evacuated and the investigation was over. So it does beg these questions as to, I would say, competing priorities. The DEA was sort of basically trying to do gumshoe law enforcement, seemingly, but the people they were investigating evidently had protection from a much more senior agency, I think the CIA.
And that's sticky too, because this is I'm really glad you're bringing up this story about these events of the 90s, because there's a continual thing, a continual implication and mystery about people being somehow protected. And Matt, I know that that probably spoke to all of us, right? Especially it comes to a head in a very interesting interview in episode 5. Right. There's in particular, I'm thinking about that. How does this protection work? Does it seem that there truly are these shadowy forces that are saying this person is untouchable?
Well, our big question was, these 4 murders that happened in Miami, where the shooter and the driver in the first 2 murders went to jail, but nobody else ever, not the shooters in the second cases, certainly not the intellectual authors. And who was behind the intellectual authors? I mean, that's the question that always fascinated me in this story is, were people being protected for some reason? Is that why we didn't see justice? And, as it goes reporting these stories, you can raise the question, you can do your best. We couldn't nail down an answer to that question, but it did seem like seemingly every nefarious person who had decision-making authority in Haiti at the time was seemingly in one way or another a CIA asset. And so there's also this very shadowy character whose code name was literally the Shadow, who's this Canadian mercenary pilot who was also involved in the Biafra War. And he was kind of the go-between between the military junta and the CIA, or at least that's how he branded himself. And so we had questions about him and what he knew. And obviously, this silencing of the radio broadcasters in Miami, we believe that the intention was to make sure, and we were told by police officers that they ultimately came to believe the intention was to make sure these guys didn't influence US policy. So it was crazy to think that these like very local murders on the streets of this ethnic neighborhood in Miami could have tentacles that raised exactly the question you just raised, Ben. But we got some interesting stuff in the podcast, so definitely listen. But we weren't able to fully nail them down, unfortunately.
That cocaine money, man, that's a lot of money. I feel like you could influence a lot of people to do a lot of things with that money.
Well, I think there's an interesting meta quality to this podcast as well. I mean, the name of it is obviously The Radio Murders. We're talking about people speaking out through broadcast, and podcasts now have become this kind of extension of traditional broadcast radio. And there is power in that ability to communicate. I mean, I remember one of the first true crime shows I worked on involved a serial killer who's still incarcerated. And it didn't occur to me till close to the episodes coming out that I could be targeted by this person who exists, still, and maybe has followers who could dox me or figure out how to send people after me and my family. And this realization just kind of hit me. And of course, nothing ever came of it. But this is a situation where things are definitely coming of it in terms of people speaking out against dangerous people who are still out there in the world, in America, in a place where you're presumed to be safe, to be able to have that freedom of speech. But not necessarily the case when you're dealing with that amount of money, that kind of interest from these powerful and dangerous people. How did that occur to you at all, or when you're doing this kind of reporting, just the position that you're playing in that kind of game of telephone, in this ability to kind of spread information and the potential for maybe even you to be targeted in some way?
Yeah, I mean, of course it crosses your mind. I think obviously as a white dude several hundred miles away from Miami, your fears are less than they might otherwise be. But it's a really good point you make about podcasting. I mean, in some ways, these four guys, they were buying the airtime by the hour, playing their music, talking about what was on their mind. Sometimes it was, local politics, sometimes international politics, sometimes just, fun banter. And in a sense, like, these guys were the early podcasters, and the radio technology, allowed them to kind of have that opportunity. But by the same token, that meant that people didn't want to see them as like capital J journalists. I mean, some of the debates we have today, frankly, like who's a journalist and who isn't. But in the case of these guys, like, their murders were not treated as the murders of journalists. People kind of diminished what they did as just kind of, commentary. And so the way I came across the story was that my co-host, Anna Arana, actually wrote a report for the Committee to Protect Journalists in the early 90s about the murders of ethnic journalists on US soil. So Haitian community, the Vietnamese community, and I think the Taiwanese community. And I read her report, and her big thing was, if somebody is murdered to silence them, that is a federal civil rights jurisdiction. And if these people were using the radio to inform their community, they were journalists. And any argument to the contrary is, has some kind of either elitism or snobism or racism involved. Because unless you want to do a totally Talmudic interpretation of journalism, what is it other than, what we're doing now?
Storytelling. Yeah. And just, right. Exactly. No, I think that's a really good point. Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, I want to jump back just a little bit more to talk about the relationship the United States had with Haiti and why that was so important, and why policy within the U.S. towards Haiti was so important. And it comes in the story that I believe it's Bill O'Neill who tells the story in the podcast. But there's this weird thing that happens where Aristide is elected, comes into power. We mentioned this was a big deal, right? Everybody was celebrating. There's a coup attempt early on before he's even inaugurated. Then he's only in power for 7-8 months, something like that. So the U.S. decides, well, okay, we need to take action. I believe this is the order goes in. The U.S. takes action by deploying a naval ship called the USS Harlan County to Haiti. What happens as it's approaching the country?
So Aristide is overthrown in a coup in 1991, and the military regime who replace him go about a campaign of slaughter, basically, of his supporters. And so what that means is you have more and more and more refugees fleeing to the US on boats, and that's always politically unacceptable, as we know today. And so the US at a certain point, even though they kind of appreciated the stability brought by their partners in the military, basically said this refugee crisis has to end. You military figures have to make an agreement with Aristide that he comes back and there's a peaceful transition of power. You guys get amnesty, but we got to stop the refugee crisis. So the military guys say yes. And the US send a ship to prepare for the arrival of Aristide with some Marines and basically making sure that he's not killed when he gets off his boat, which is coming in a week later. As they pull into the dock, this paramilitary force called FRAP basically take over the dock. They've been using the radio in Haiti to summon their supporters. And they basically make this wild scene on the dock, and they're chanting. This was like a week after Black Hawk Down in Somalia as well. If you land the ship, this will be another Mogadishu. This US diplomat arrives on the dock to try and defuse the situation. They hold him at gunpoint, they hold him hostage. And the ship, Bill O'Neill, as you mentioned, is watching this. He's a UN human rights observer from his window. And he just sees the USS Navy ship just turn around and disappear back over the horizon to dock where it came from, which ironically enough is Guantanamo Bay. And so that's it. No return of Aristide. And what's quite remarkable is that Frapp, the leader of Frapp, was also a CIA asset, and he claimed that the CIA knew in advance of his plans at the dock, and that he'd assured them that no American life would be hurt, but they let it go
Constant,
ahead.
right?
Yeah, Constant, yeah.
But it's so nuts to me that action was only taken, at least the way I understand it, action was taken to send that ship because of optics, right? That ultimately it feels that way, right? Because the policy is to maintain the power that's there in the military.
Exactly. And Aristide, while he was in exile, was basically, a lot of pressure was put on him in return for being sent back to accept various economic reforms, to give amnesty to his political opponents. So he eventually did go back, but many people say that he was a different person. And so, yes, the optics of having him in power could stem the refugee crisis, but the policies that he wanted to enact the first time round, he had to basically eschew as a condition of being allowed to go back. And those policies were policies of the left: redistribution, reform, military reform, disbanding the military, things which were extremely unpopular to the powers that be, and frankly, they're some of their allies in the US.
I think that's one of the key points to tease out here, although it may already seem wild to some of us listening today to start with a brief history of Haiti and then go to a series of, as you said, 4 murders. And then all of a sudden, this rabbit hole takes us to talking about the dirty, dirty business of the intelligence game, right? The way that this web connects is endlessly fascinating to me. I think one of the questions people will ask at this point is, does it seem that the U.S. practices toward Haiti are meant to keep the country down, or are they meant to push it toward a certain ideological vision? Like that, you said they don't want another Cuba, right? What does the CIA want in this situation? And is it constant, or does it, that's an accidental pun. Is it consistent, I should say? Does it change over time?
I think that's a great question. And I don't think there's an evil genius saying, how do we make Haiti's future as difficult and terrible as possible. I think that's a downstream outcome of other types of decisions. That said, a police officer in Miami did tell us that having chaos in Haiti basically allowed the US to continue to exert maximal influence, because an unstable country with a small elite, a military elite and business elite, which to all the world looks like it's, quote unquote, whole country. There's not a civil society resistant to the imposition of whatever the powerful neighbor's whims are, because it's being relied on for humanitarian aid and for, weapons and all those kinds of things. So, the last project I worked on was about Mexico and the murders of women on the El Paso Juarez border, which you very kindly had me on the show to discuss. And it's not great being a much poorer country in the backyard of a much bigger and richer one. And one of the guests we spoke to on the podcast, who's Haitian, compared it to the situation in Ukraine, which I thought was extremely provocative. But basically saying what Russia would not allow Ukraine to come into the Western sphere of influence. And she was saying it's the same for Haiti. So, that's a hot take, but provocative.
And we're going to pause for a word from our sponsor. We'll be right back with Oz Woloshyn and Silence the Radio Murders.
And we have returned. Let's jump right back into our conversation with Oz.
So I want to get back to Constant, that guy that we said was the head of Frapp, who was also CIA, I guess. And it's a question about power projection. It's interesting to me the tactics this individual would use to incite fear in people who opposed him, as well as incite, some kind of fervor in people who were following him. Could you talk a little bit about some of the ritualistic stuff he would do to just project an image of power?
Yeah, so Toto Constant was kind of like a rich kid. That his father had been the army chief of staff to Papa Doc Duvalier. And apparently young Toto would hear his father and Papa Doc plotting late into the night about how to control Haiti, how to exert power, policy. And so in this chaos after 1991 and the coup against Aristide, he emerges as this sort of figure who is able to win the trust of US intelligence because he speaks English perfectly. He's been Western educated. His father dealt with, people from the agency in the past. And so he has this one side of his personality, which is this like very suave, sophisticated, smooth operator who knows how to get what he needs from US intelligence. But he also understands the very powerful iconography of power and violence, which he learns from Papa Doc Duvalier. Papa Doc Duvalier would kind of, voodoo religion is like very much, the common religion of the people in Haiti. But there are certain voodoo archetypes who have different valences, and Papa Doc lent very heavily into the archetype of Baron Samedi, or the Lord of Death, and dressed like the Lord of Death. And basically Constant, in the early 90s, in order to was basically very consciously drawing on this Lord of Death, Papa Doc iconography. He apparently would emerge from this pile of burning skulls, which were rumored to be the skulls of his victims. And so...
Real showman.
A real showman. And what he wanted to do was to... he was the perfectly educated gentleman with the intelligence agencies, but he was the Papa Doc's successor with the Haitian people. And the fact that he was so versatile, I think, speaks to one of the bigger themes of this show, which is kind of like information wars and, the power of controlling the message or the power of controlling the image. And so then there's a whole nother layer of complexity, which is saying that you're on the payroll of the CIA can get you power even if you're not. So like there's, it just goes, layer and layer and layer into basically how you project authority in a place where there's no real media, and it's very hard to separate fact from fiction.
But if somebody in Miami is countering what you are projecting there in Haiti, it could be a real problem, I imagine. Like, and just that concept of undermining a message all the way over in a different country is so fascinating to me. And I just feel like when you are all out projecting an image that may not be true, it is very, very dangerous to have a journalist saying the true things, no matter what they are.
And state powers know this. I mean, I'll say the quiet part out loud. Check out Voice of America. You know what I mean? Ask why they do what they do, where they do it. It's true. There is this thread of what's sometimes called hearts and minds in a dismissive way, but information, media, they're another theater of conflict, right? Another sphere in which these battles can occur. And I think one of the things that a lot of us hearing the broad strokes of this story today need to understand is that this was not that long ago. The 1990s were not super long ago. People active in this story are still around. And I've got to ask, Oz, did you find yourself just as a journalist, as a creator and storyteller, you really go hard in the paint with this stuff. Did you ever feel that you were in an uncomfortable situation when you were talking to some of these people?
Yeah, a couple of times. Certainly when we went to go and doorstep Mr. Thermitus, that was pretty uncomfortable. But we had another interview, and we were kind of expecting that to be a bit scary and uncomfortable, so we prepared for it. So that was one thing. But we had another interview with a source in Miami who basically went crazy and started shouting like the people you're reporting on were filth, they were scum, they were drug dealers, and what are you doing wasting your time? And it was kind of quite shit, like shook us up a little bit. And we were like, well, what? Like, but what we realized was like the contest over the interpretation of this story is still relevant. And so he was somebody who was very much, I would say, on the other side of this divide. And so the kind of litigation as to why these people were murdered and who killed them kind of remains relevant. So that was pretty fascinating. And then, of course, while we were in Miami on one of our reporting trips, I think the president of Haiti, Jovenel Moïse, was assassinated. And that made us think as well, okay, I mean, this has all of the same hallmarks in terms of drugs, in terms of US intelligence, in terms of like control of the region. And so we actually get to the assassination towards the end of our show, and hopefully some of the drivers and context required to really understand that killing also come through in our reporting.
When I hear stories like this and this kind of reporting and seeing the red threads that run throughout it and the connections to the United States and the kind of, covert parts of the United States government, I think the U.S. likes to project itself as having this moral high ground, as like being this moral authority in the world. And the more you hear about stories like this, the more you realize it's all kind of optics, and there is no moral high ground. And whatever other, totalitarian regime, at least they're outward about it. It just makes me really, it just kind of sucks some of the hope that you have out of thinking that maybe we live in a country that does, want something better or have. I don't know. I'm just rambling here.
No, but I mean, I hear you. But on the other hand, like, this was a place where people wanted to come, and as horrific as their treatment was when they arrived, they did settle here. They could speak freely for a bit until they were killed. I mean, it's not. I mean, it's. I think it's. There's. Of course, there's a lot to criticize, but there's a reason why this continues to be the country where so many refugees from whether it's Afghanistan or Haiti or Ukraine want to come. And so that, I think it's also good not to be too nihilistic, because there's, the good parts are worth celebrating and preserving. And so yes, I think it's the behavior, particularly like outside of the borders, is pretty appalling. And Guantanamo, funny enough, when Haitian refugees in the 90s were fleeing, if they were intercepted at sea, they were actually sent to Guantanamo and held there while their case was being processed. So the use of Guantanamo as a detention center post 9/11 was also kind of, I would say, tried out during this period of Haitian history, which is quite intense to think about.
So I want to celebrate the good parts of refugees coming to the United States, because they are, and we should. I think I was a little naive going into this when thinking about the dangers that younger people, the children of refugee families who make it here, the potential influence because of usually their parents' situations of being overworked, like having to make ends meet, being alone a lot of the time, the potential influence of darker forces like gangs and groups that could influence them and maybe pick them up as a second family or something. You talk about that in the show. Did you see any of that in speaking to people?
Yeah, I mean, I think the gang recruitment issue was huge in the early 90s. And of course, the fact that the people who pulled the trigger, to anyone's real mind, are not the people who need to be, of course, they need to be brought to justice in the sense they committed a murder, but it wasn't their idea. So it's different from a normal murder. And the fact that you had this population of kids of refugees living in Miami, Haitian refugees, bullied at school. There's a lot of stigma that Haitians carried AIDS at the time, and their parents were working, double shifts to send money back home. There couldn't have been a more fertile population to recruit to do dirty work. And so what we found was a lot of these Haitian military figures and Tonton Macoutes who ended up in Miami, they didn't do their own dirty work. Instead, they recruited the kids of fellow refugees. And so that was another thing the radio broadcasters were calling out on air. They were saying, these people are corrupting our kids. We have to stop this. Not only are they, trafficking cocaine, they're using our kids to do it, and they're using the proceeds to support the regime in Haiti. It's the most disturbing and horrific vicious circle, and so yeah, on all parts of that circle, there was this kind of contest, because the nexus of the drugs and the power and the money and the influence both in Miami and Haiti was so strong, and also so hard to understand for people outside the community. And I think that's, again, I mean, the police, I think there were many problems with the investigation, but to be fair to them, it also wasn't necessarily the easiest one.
And this gets us to even even further toward the present day, we have seen that practice occur in other diaspora communities. There is a very disturbing and very valid argument that the U.S. Is one of the creators of MS-13, Mara Salvatruchas and so on. And we can see something similar here. I'm also, to be fully transparent with everybody on the show today, folks, we don't know how the show ends yet, right?
No,
we are, again, it's still in publication. So episode 7 is going to be available for everyone in the next week
on
or
Thursday
so.
next week. But if you're a subscriber to iHeart True Crime Plus, you can get it early. So yeah.
Oh yeah.
And we have eight episodes total.
8 episodes total. So what do you hope people can take away from this story? And as we said, some of the people who are clearly involved in the murders have not been held to account. So what can the average listener walk away from the show with?
Well, I think it's what's worth fighting for is always an important question. And, First Amendment rights, being able to speak freely, an attack on anyone that speaks freely in this country that goes unpunished is an attack on that right, as far as we're concerned, me and my partner, Anna. And so, there's a lot of extreme political divide, to say the least, in this country right now. But there are some things that should be bipartisan. And no matter how much you don't like what somebody else is saying, you shouldn't wish physical harm on them for saying it. And so that's one thing. I also think what's really important is getting justice. So you might say, 30 years later, does it really matter? Well, the smears about these people are still alive. They got smeared in our interview process. They were drug dealers, they were scum. But all of our reporting suggested the opposite. So categorically answering who is responsible for this is very important. And then thirdly, I don't know what you do with the information, but I think just the awareness that these bigger forces of geopolitical power can be at play in the most seemingly surprising places, I just find personally very fascinating. That's what drew me into the story. There's this brilliant Joan Didion quote. She wrote this book, Miami, about the CIA's successful attempts to, foment the anti-Castro invasionary forces in Miami. And she has this line, decisions taken in Washington from time to time leave a certain residue on the board. And that phrase, a certain residue on the board, is that unfortunately is what the victims of these crimes were as far as Langley is concerned.
You know what left some residue on my board? Your theme song. Can you tell us a little about the theme song? It's so good.
Oh, I'm so happy you like it. It's actually a friend of mine who called Oliver Rodigan, aka Cadenza. His father basically was one of the pioneers of bringing dancehall and reggae music to the UK, David Rodigan. And Oliver is the most brilliant composer, written for Space Jam and Beyonce, as well as our podcast, which is kind of insane.
Wow. That's why it's so good.
And,
it's so good.
I heard Beyonce bragging about that.
Exactly. He asked her not to talk about it, but sometimes.
How can you not? No, I'm with you, Matt. It has a very visceral quality that evokes the themes of the show, and that's not easy to do in a instrumental piece of music. So
it's cinematic.
Very much, kudos to that, and the whole score, and just the whole production. It's really something to be incredibly proud of.
Well, thank you.
Do check out the show, folks. We talk about these things when they are important to us and when we feel like there is a story that needs to be told. And this is very much the case with the radio murders. So Oz, we've got to let the people know, as we mentioned at the top, you have many other projects that you have worked on, some of which we've discussed at length here on Stuff They Don't Want You to Know. For the curious, where can they learn more about your work? Where can they hear this show? Where can they find your other projects?
So this show is called Silence, the Radio Murders, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts, especially iHeart Podcast app and iHeart True Crime Plus. love our partners at iHeart. And then as for our other work, I've actually recently launched a production company with my partner Mangesh, who you all know very well.
Mango?
Love dearly.
Big fan.
And the production company is called Kaleidoscope. You can find all of our shows on www.k-scope.com. And I think our Twitter is Kaleidoscope Podcasts. So this is honestly a little darker in tone than much of what we do at Kaleidoscope. Our next show is about this leftist Greek bank robber who robs the rich to give money to the poor in Greece. As it happens, he is also on some Interpol list and like very high up on the agenda of U.S. intelligence because of the fears about leftist contagion in Europe. So we can never fully resist.
Oh no!
But that one's and we have one about the last Soviet cosmonaut who got trapped in space when the Soviet Union fell, and we always we're so excited to have a chance to talk about our shows on other wonderful shows like this one. So thank you.
I also highly recommend Wild Chocolate, and in full transparency, I do make a small cameo on Mangesh's project Skyline Drive, which is ostensibly about astrology, but I don't want to spoil any more than that.
I think I'm on there somewhere too. I did a thing for him.
You both did
right
warnings
yeah.
at the top, right?
I think that's right. Yes, exactly.
So thank you to our pal Mangesh as well, and Oz. Thank you again so much for your time. We are right there with you, folks. We can't wait to see or hear, I should say, the conclusion of again this incredibly distressing, profoundly important tale.
In the meantime, let us know what you thought about this interview, your thoughts on this and other stories we cover on the show. You can find us on various social media platforms of note. We are Conspiracy Stuff on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Conspiracy Stuff Show on Instagram and TikTok.
If you want to give us a call, dial 1-833-STDWYTK. It's a voicemail system. Please give us a cool moniker, just not your government name. Just keep that anonymity there. And you've got 3 minutes. Say whatever you want. If you want to say more than that, why not instead send us a good old-fashioned email? We are
conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.